Well, today we're going to be talking about how to develop a youth ministry budget. That's going to be a step-by-step process on how to write a youth ministry budget. Now, the first thing to consider when writing this budget is a bit of a relational issue. There's a very key individual in your congregation that you need to spend some time with to find out exactly how they would like to see you handle these sorts of things. And that, believe it or not, is your church treasurer. It's a very key individual for you in your ministry. And so you need to find out from them, how do they want you to develop this budget? How do they want you to itemize things? What is it? How much detail? What does it need to look like for them so that they can be on your side when it comes time to actually start drawing up your budget? The second thing to consider when you're making up your youth ministry budget is mapping out your year. What sorts of events are you doing? Are you doing events that are going to require a significant amount of travel? Are you doing events that are going to require you to rent certain locations or purchase certain things? These are things to itemize so that you're able to map things out a little bit better. The other thing to consider is that when you're dealing with retreats, it would be a really good idea to probably put retreats on their own budget line in your overall youth ministry budget so that you can track the coming in and coming out of funds a lot easier that way. And especially if you're in a ministry where you're running a middle school, junior high, and senior high, or maybe even young adult retreat, or a camp, or perhaps even a VBS. The third thing is to figure out how much of the funds are going to be raised through the students paying for things on their own and through fundraising, that sort of idea. For example, let's say that you're going out on ski trips and that kind of thing. One of the things that I've seen some people do, and it's worked fairly well for us in our ministry, is that when we're doing some type of a social function, like a ski trip, like canoeing, like skating, whatever it be, that the students paid anywhere from 75 to 100% of the costs on that. And in that way, it was a lot easier to justify the funds that were going out for that because there's going to be students who are not going to be able to afford it, and we don't want finances to be an issue as to whether or not someone can go. The other thing to consider with this thing also is that when you have other types of functions, like service projects, there may be room there to subsidize the students to be able to come with you for these kinds of things, whether that be subsidization through travel or through a specific dollar amount per student. These are some of the ways that I've seen it broken down before. Key to this whole idea, and whenever making up a budget and figuring out where the funds are coming from, is that no student should ever be disqualified from being able to attend your function because of money. You should always make sure that you have some type of buffer in there to be able to subsidize students for being able to come. Now, is it realistic to try and figure out all the costs involved in your student year? Maybe not, but you need to project forward a little bit as best you can so that you can fundraise for whatever it is you need to be fundraising for if you're in a congregation that does that. And I know that there's a lot of you out there that don't really get a budget, so most of your stuff comes from either personal investment in this or from fundraising or from the students paying for things. When you are fundraising, it is really good to let your congregation have an idea of how much you're going to fundraise in the year so that it's not taking away from the larger church budget, and the church is aware that you are interested and concerned about how the overall budget of the church is doing. Okay, next, it's really important for you to prepare a very detailed outline of what specific funds are being used for. For example, let's say you have about $1,500 dedicated towards your senior high youth retreat. It'd be really good for your congregation and for your church council to know a breakdown of what those funds are being used for. Are some of the funds being used for transportation? Are some of the funds being used for subsidizing? Are some of the funds being used for the speaker and whatever else you may have in terms of expenses in there? If you break it down a little bit easier, it makes more sense to people, and it's a lot easier for them to take and pass for you. This point's really important. It's very important that no one individual has exclusive access to these funds. For me as a youth pastor, I actually handed the responsibility of the funds to someone else in the ministry because I didn't want to have any kind of conflict of interest or any sorts of thinking that I might be using the funds in an inappropriate way. And so I handed it off to someone else. We kept an incredibly accurate and detailed accounting for what was happening there that was consistent with how the church kept their records. Really neat. If you are able to get your church treasurer to actually take care of the books in your ministry, you'll be doing yourself an incredible favor. And again, it shows that you are wanting to be accountable for the funds that you're using, and you're also willing to submit to whomever it is that everyone else is already submitting to as well. Here's some tips for how you can actually get your budget past at this point. One of the key things is that make sure that your budget is very concise, very clean, and is typed well so that it's easy to understand and easy to read. Another thing to do is contact people that you think might object to your budget for whatever reason, and ask them for advice. If there's something specific that you know that they're going to object to, ask them how they would handle that particular scenario. And always figure things out in the way of how much would it cost per student per year to run your ministry. And that way you're able to break down what you're looking at in terms of helping people understand, so that it becomes a relational issue and not a money issue, if you want to look at it that way. The other thing is this: listen. Listen to how other people are handling their budgets. Ask a lot of questions. Listen to what's going on in the congregation. If you know, and if you're watching the accounting records that are being presented forward, if you know that the congregation is struggling financially, well, don't ask for a large budget. The other thing is also be reasonable and be realistic. I remember a story. There was a youth pastor who was in a congregation. The youth budget was $1,500 for the entire year. It was his very first year. For this following year, he asked for a $25,000 youth budget. He didn't last very long in that congregation. Not because of the money necessarily, but it definitely set a tone for him. How you respect the funds of your congregation becomes a critical point in your ministry in terms of credibility and in terms of longevity. So very key. Ask a lot of questions. Find out the people that you think are going to object and ask them for some advice on how they think things should be done and how you can work certain things out. Another tip: make sure that your ministry needs are reflected in your budget. For example, let's say that you're budgeting about $900 for an event, but you only use $150. Well, if it's an annual event and you know you're only going to use $150, then respect your congregation in that sense. Don't ask for $900. That way, you've got the credibility that later on, if you do need more funds for something, they know that you respect where the funds are coming from, and they're more likely to give it to you. The other thing is that you need to take into account resourcing your leaders. If there's anything that your leaders are going to need from you, it's resourcing and also encouragement. So if there's some type of a gift that you give them at Christmas or at the end of the student year, reflect that in your budget so that people can see that you're not just about the youth, you're also about your volunteers, and that becomes a very critical thing in terms of how you're spending your funds. Well, that's it. That's a how-to guide, a very, very concise guide on how to make a youth ministry budget. I know that there are a lot of things that you could probably add to it, but in terms of developing a basic framework on how to develop a budget and a few tips to go along with it, this is what we have for you. So thank you for listening. Feel free to discuss things in the discussion board. And if you have any questions, I'll be in the discussion board as well so that we can answer them as best we can for you.